The Dragoon Mountains sat quiet in the distance, soaked in shadow and bruised sky. The wind carried a bitter edge as it rolled across the scrubland, kicking grit into the porch cracks of a weather-beaten ranch house that had stood longer than most marriages in the territory. Silas Braddock pulled the barn door shut with both hands, the old hinges complaining under the strain. His coat was already heavy with rain and grit. The cuffs of his shirt were damp to the elbow, sticking to skin that was weathered, thin, and tight around the joints. He didn't rush. He never did. Work was work, and there was no one else to do it. He stood for a second under the small lean-to beside the barn, listening to the storm as it shifted from dust to rain. You could feel it more than see it. The temperature drop, the stillness just before the downpour. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and looked out across the pasture, where nothing moved except the wind through the dry grass. There wasn't a soul for miles. He liked it that way. At 52, Silas had learned that people were a kind of risk he couldn't afford anymore. 5 years ago, a barn fire had taken his wife and their 10-year-old boy. A broken lantern, a dry wind, too much hay packed too tight. That's all it took. And the silence that came after, not the kind in the room, but the kind in his chest, never really left. He had no family left, no church ties. He didn't write letters. He didn't expect any. His days were the same. Wake up before sunrise, feed the stock, mend the fencing, cook what he needed and nothing more. Some nights, he read from the same old Bible, even though he wasn't sure he believed half of it anymore. But he read anyway. Routine was safer than hope. So when a knock came, not even a knock, really just the sound of something soft and hesitant at the front gate, he froze. It wasn't the wind. Wasn't an animal either. His gut told him before his head did. He stepped out from the barn and looked toward the gate. Someone was there. A girl, no, a woman. Barefoot, soaked straight through. Her dress clung to her legs like rags, heavy with water and grit. She stood gripping the fence post like she might fall if she let go. One hand held a rope attached to a winded mare, head down, sides heaving. Silas stared at her, his jaw set. She looked back, not saying anything. Didn't wave. Didn't cry. Just looked. Her lips were chapped. Her dark hair was stuck to her cheeks. She was young, maybe 20, but her face had the kind of tension that didn't come from age. It came from running. There were bruises on her wrist. Old ones. A fresh scrape across her knee. Her eyes were sharp but wary, like she'd already decided she wouldn't stay long. He didn't move at first. He just looked at her. His first thought, she's trouble. His second thought, so was I once. Still, he hesitated. He didn't know her story and didn't ask. But the look on her face, that tight, deliberate blankness, told him enough. Someone had hurt her. Someone thought they owned her. He stepped through the rain, boots crunching in the wet gravel. Didn't say a word, just unlatched the gate and stepped aside. She flinched slightly as she passed, eyes flicking toward him like a stray dog waiting for the boot. But he didn't touch her, didn't even face her. He just turned back toward the house and left the gate swinging in the wind. Her footsteps were light, but uneven behind him. The mare followed without protest. That alone told him how far she'd pushed the animal. The thing was more bone than muscle, legs trembling. Inside, Silas lit the oil lamp with practiced fingers, turned it low, and moved toward the fireplace. The coals were still alive. He stoked them with kindling, added wood from the stack, and let the fire grow. The heat crept back into the room slowly. He didn't look at her directly. She stood near the door, dripping. Her hands trembled, but she wasn't crying, just holding herself tight, the way someone does when they're trying not to shake. He pointed to the chair closest to the hearth, then turned and rummaged through the cedar trunk near the window. A blanket, worn but clean. He handed it over without a word and turned to the stove. She sat, didn't speak, pulled the blanket tight around herself and leaned toward the fire with cautious, aching movement. Silas warmed beans in a pan, opened a jar of jerky, filled a tin cup with well water, and set it on the table. No sirve. He hadn't used it in weeks. When he finally sat across from her, he saw her eyes shift toward his hands, the thick knuckles, old scars, the burns still visible on the back of his left hand. Her own fingers gripped the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. He didn't ask what happened to her. He wouldn't. That wasn't his place. Not yet. But he did wonder if she had anyone waiting for her, if she'd even tell him if she did. He doubted it. Minutes passed. The rain hit harder, now drumming like fists on the roof. Finally, she spoke. Voice raw, dry as ash. Kaya. That was it. One word. He gave a small nod. That was enough for now. They didn't eat together, not really. She stayed by the fire. He ate standing. When he dropped the spoon back into the pan, she flinched so slightly it was almost invisible. But he saw it, registered it, remembered the same look in his wife's eyes once. Long ago, before the fire, before she ever trusted him to raise a hand only to work. Later, after she'd curled up in the chair, still wrapped in the blanket, still wide-eyed, despite the exhaustion etched deep into her face, Silas fetched a second quilt and laid it over her shoulders. Quietly, gently. He didn't ask himself why he was doing it. He just did. Then he sat down across the room again, elbows on his knees, and watched the fire until the storm passed. The rain stopped sometime before dawn. The clouds hadn't cleared, but the silence had changed, softer now. Wet earth instead of wind. No thunder, just the occasional groan of the wooden beams settling in the walls. Silas hadn't slept. Not really. He'd doze in the chair by the cold stove, boots still on, hat in his lap. His back ached from the position, but he didn't move until the first threads of gray light crept in through the window pane. Calla was still curled in the same chair, barely visible under the quilt. At some point in the night, she had shifted her weight, tucking her knees up to her chest. Her breathing was even. Eyes closed. One hand gripped the edge of the blanket like she didn't quite trust it not to disappear. Silas stood slowly, his joints popping. He moved through the house like a man who didn't want to wake a child, careful, silent. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. There were things you didn't do to someone who'd been hurt. You didn't startle them. You didn't ask what you weren't ready to hear. He filled the kettle and set on the stove, then walked outside to check the mare. The horse was still there, tied loosely to the fence, head low but standing. She'd made it through the night, but barely. Silas approached slow, hand out, eyes scanning her flanks. Ribs showing, one back leg favoring. No obvious break, but a bad sprain at least. He ran a hand down the leg, and the mare shifted but didn't kick. Someone had run her hard and left her half-fed. He'd seen it before. Travelers too cheap to care for a horse properly, or too angry to bother. He brought out a blanket and some oats, set them near her, and checked the hooves. Mud-caked. No shoes. No brands. No brands. That told him something. Either the horse was stolen, or she'd come from a man who didn't care enough to mark what was his. That narrowed the possibilities. When Silas walked back inside, Calla was awake, sitting up, still wrapped in the quilt, but her eyes were open and alert. Not scared exactly, but guarded, like she'd woken up in worse places and didn't assume safety just because the fire was warm. "You hungry?" he asked. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since she arrived. She nodded once. He ladled warm oats into 2 bowls and set one on the table. She came to sit slowly, every movement cautious, like her body hadn't quite decided to stay. They ate in silence. After a few bites, Calla spoke. Her voice still rough, but clearer now. "Is it just you?" Silas didn't look up. "Yeah." A beat passed. "Always been." He shook his head. "Not always." She didn't press, and he didn't offer more. Calla's fingers were thin and cracked at the knuckles. Her hands trembled slightly when she held the spoon. It wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion. He knew the difference. When she finished, she set the bowl down gently and looked toward the window. "You got anyone coming?" she asked. "No." She nodded like that made sense, like she already knew. "Is it all right if I stay a little while?" Her voice was flat. No begging, just the question. Neutral, as if she was already prepared for a no. Silas studied her for a moment. She wasn't asking for shelter. She was asking for time. A place to not run. He nodded. "Few days. We'll figure it out." She nodded back. The next hour passed quiet. She helped wash the dishes. Didn't talk much, but she watched how he moved where he kept things. She was memorizing the layout. A habit, probably. Know the exits. Know what's in reach. It told him more than words could. He gave her a set of dry clothes. His late wife's old work shirt and trousers. They were too big but clean. She didn't complain, just changed behind the curtain in the back room, folded her wet dress neatly, and left it by the hearth to dry. By noon, they were outside. She followed him to the corral, helped him carry a fence rail, said little, but she didn't flinch when he raised a hammer. That was something. She was still watching him closely, though. Not like she was scared of him. Not anymore, but like she hadn't decided if he was worth trusting. He didn't ask her about the man, whoever he was, the bruises, the tired horse, the fact that she arrived barefoot in the middle of a storm. He didn't need the details to understand what kind of trouble a girl like her might have come from. Still, he noticed things. The way she never turned her back fully. How she kept the knife from breakfast on the table near her seat. How she scanned the ridgeline out of habit. She was used to being hunted, or at least found. That night, they ate stew in silence. He lit the fire early, gave her the cot in the back room. He stayed by the hearth. Before she turned in, she stood in the doorway a moment longer than needed. She didn't say thank you. Didn't have to. Silas understood the look. It wasn't gratitude. It was caution starting to ease. Later, long after the fire had gone down and the wind returned in soft gusts outside, Silas lay awake, staring at the rafters. She hadn't told him anything. No story. No name for the man who'd sent her running. No destination. But she was still here, and he'd let her stay. He didn't know if that was wise. But something in his chest, something long buried, didn't feel quite so empty anymore. And that, more than anything, scared him. Because things that matter have a way of being taken. 3 days passed. The ground dried. The mare's limp eased. The rhythm of the ranch held. Calla stayed. She rose early, same as Silas. She didn't ask what needed doing. She just followed his lead. Brought water from the well. Helped gather eggs. Tended the fire. She moved like someone used to labor, but not used to choosing it. And each task seemed to pull her a little further out of the guarded state she arrived in. Silas noticed, but said nothing. It was better that way. In town, a woman like her would have drawn questions: who she belonged to, where she'd come from. Out here, the questions didn't matter as much as the work. And she worked hard. Too hard sometimes. Like she didn't know how to stop. He caught her once, trying to haul a full sack of feed, her arms straining, face set. He stepped in, lifted it from her hands without a word. She didn't thank him, but she let him. That afternoon, while patching the east fence, she finally asked what had been hanging quiet in the space between them for days. "You gonna ask me where I came from?" Silas didn't look up from the post he was reinforcing. "You tell me if you wanted to." A long silence followed. She leaned against the rail, watching him work. "I was with a man," she said finally. "Traveled with him a while. Didn't have much choice." He nodded once. Didn't ask more. He didn't want to make her explain the kind of "didn't have much choice" she meant. He already had a good idea. Calla didn't look at him as she continued. He'd take what he wanted when he wanted. Said I owed him for keeping me fed. I kept moving, but I got tired. I stopped caring if someone caught me. Silas straightened, looked at her carefully. And then, I kept running anyway. Got on that horse. Rode till she gave out. Found your gate. Figured if someone was going to shoot me, might as well be someone who looked like they could still feel bad about it. Silas didn't laugh. He didn't smile either. But he met her gaze with something steady. "I don't shoot people unless they give me a reason," he said. "Yeah, I figured." She went back to work after that, but something changed. The quiet between them felt different. Not tense. Not polite. Just shared. That night, while he boiled potatoes and she sat cleaning a pan near the stove, she looked over and asked, "Your wife?" "What happened?" Silas stopped, his hand hovering over the pot. "Fire," he said. 5 years back. Barn caught. I was in town. Came home to smoke." Calla didn't respond right away. Just nodded. "I figured it was something like that." He turned to face her. "Why? You keep the house like someone's still here." That empty chair by the fire. Her shawl folded on the shelf like she's coming back for it. Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. She wasn't wrong. The next morning, he found her outside before dawn, feeding the chickens. She moved like she belonged there, like she knew the rhythm of the place now. But that piece cracked just after noon. A distant shape on horseback crested the ridge near the southern boundary. Too far to see clearly, but close enough for concern. Silas was the first to notice. He lowered the axe he'd been using, wiped his brow, and stood still, watching the horizon. Calla noticed the change in him before she saw the rider. When she did, she went pale. She stepped back instinctively, shoulders tense. "You know him?" Silas asked, voice low. "Could be," she said. "He rode with the man I escaped from. Or he could have been sent to bring me back." Silas didn't ask for more. He didn't need more. Instead, he walked to the barn and returned with his rifle. Not flashy, not new, but clean and loaded. He handed it to her. Her eyes widened. "You sure?" He nodded. "You want to run again? I won't stop you. But if you stay, you don't stay helpless." She took the rifle. Her hand shook, but she didn't argue. The rider never came closer, just hovered near the edge of sight line, then disappeared back over the ridge as the sun started to dip. Silas watched the spot long after the figure was gone. That night, neither of them said much, but neither of them slept either. They sat near the fire, each lost in their own thoughts, the rifle propped between them like a line drawn in the dirt. Silas stared into the flames, wondering how long it would be before trouble came knocking for real. Calla sat with her knees tucked to her chest, the quilt pulled high, her fingers twitching now and then as if remembering the grip of the rifle. He didn't tell her to relax. She'd earned her fear, but he also didn't plan on letting anyone take her without a fight. And somewhere in the uneasy silence, an understanding settled between them. If she stayed, he would protect her, not because she was his, but because he remembered what it felt like to lose someone you should have protected. And Calla, for the first time in a long time, felt like maybe she wasn't on her own anymore. Not yet family, but no longer alone. The rider didn't return the next day, but his shadow lingered. Silas rose early, same as always, and found Calla already outside, stacking firewood near the porch. Her movements were sharper now, not rushed, measured, controlled. She didn't ask if he'd seen anything. She didn't need to. They were both thinking the same thing. It wasn't over. That morning, Silas took her farther out on the property, beyond the north ridge, with a fence line cut through high brush and wind-worn stone. He showed her the old hunting trail that curved back toward the spring, the place where the stream still ran clean, even in summer. "This part's quiet," he said. "If you ever need to disappear fast." Calla nodded. "You planning on me needing to?" "I'm planning on being ready." They walked most of the boundary together. Calla learned where the rifle was kept in the barn, where the extra shells were stashed. Silas didn't treat her like a guest. He treated her like someone who had a right to know. That mattered. In the afternoon, she caught him watching her again. Not with suspicion, with something harder to define, like he was waiting for her to change her mind and vanish. "You think I'll run?" she asked. He paused, shovel in hand, halfway through turning the garden soil. "I think you've had to." She studied his face. "I don't want to." Silas nodded once. Didn't say more, but something in his shoulders eased. Later that day, they sat on the porch in silence, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. The mare was in the paddock again, walking easier now. Calla leaned back in the old rocking chair that still creaked like it did when Silas's wife used to sit there with her sewing. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. He didn't answer right away. "I did," he finally said. "For a while. After the fire. Thought about selling the land. Thought about putting a gun in my mouth. Didn't do either. Why not?" He looked out across the field, hands clasped between his knees. "Because something about staying, even when it hurts, feels like it matters." Calla didn't respond. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. But later that night, after the dishes were done and the fire burned low, she went to the shelf and unfolded the old shawl that had belonged to his wife. She held it in her hands for a long time, then folded it again just as carefully and put it back. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The next morning, they woke to crows circling over the southern ridge. Silas watched them from the corral, his stomach tightening. Crows didn't circle for no reason. Something was dead out there, or dying. Calla saw it too. She came to stand beside him, rifle slung over her shoulder. He didn't ask if she was ready. She already was. They saddled the horses, Calla on the older gelding, Silas on his chestnut, and rode out past the stream, past the broken ridge where the rider had last been seen. They found the man less than a mile from the property line, slumped over in the brush, his horse dead beside him, flies already thick around the mouth. His leg had been shredded by something, wolf, maybe, or he'd taken a fall too steep for the terrain. Either way, he hadn't made it far. Calla stiffened when she saw his face. Recognition flickered, then hardened into something colder. "I knew him," she said. "He the one?" "No, but he worked for him." They didn't speak for a while. Silas checked the man's pockets. No letters. Nobody. Just a dull revolver and half a bottle of whiskey. He left both. "What do you want to do with him?" Silas asked. Calla looked down at the body. Thought for a long moment. "Leave him. Let the land take him." He nodded. They rode back without another word. That night, Calla lit the lamp herself. She cooked. She served him a plate. She sat across from him and didn't flinch when the thunder cracked overhead. Silas didn't ask how she felt. He just watched her. And when she finally looked up from her plate and met his eyes, her voice was steady. "I'm not running anymore." He nodded. "Then I guess you're home." The days that followed passed without trouble. But the kind of peace that settled over the ranch wasn't simple. It was watchful, earned, like a breath held just a second too long. Calla didn't sleep with one eye open anymore, but she still checked the door at night. Silas still sat with a rifle within reach. No one said it aloud, but they both knew the man who died near the ridge hadn't come on his own. Someone had sent him, and someone would notice when he didn't come back. But the land didn't care about that. Fences still broke. Chickens still needed feeding. The well still needed checking after the last storm washed some of the soil out from the base. Life, as always, moved forward whether you were ready or not. That morning, Silas stood in the garden with a coil of wire and a post driver. Calla worked beside him, hammering staples into a new cedar post. She worked efficiently. He hadn't taught her. She'd watched and figured it out. "You've done this before," he said, not quite a question. She glanced up, brushing sweat from her brow. "Used to help with the fencing on a farm outside Abilene. Before everything. You grew up out there?" She shook her head. "Didn't grow up anywhere, really. Just got older." Silas paused at that. It was the first time she'd offered anything resembling a past. She continued stapling. "I was 10 when I got sold off the first time. Man said he needed help tending chickens. Said I'd be fed." Her voice didn't shake. There was no farm. Just a shack and a lock on the inside of the door. He didn't speak. She didn't look at him. "When I finally got away, I stuck with another girl who knew the trails west. We made it as far as Yuma before a saloon keeper offered us coin to clean. She died that winter. Fever. I just kept moving." Silas listened in silence, jaw tight. "You don't have to tell me," he said, finally. Calla stood upright, arms folded across her chest. "Ido, if I'm going to stay here, you should know what kind of life I've had." He looked her dead in the eye. "It ain't the life that defines you." A silence passed between them. It wasn't cold. It wasn't sad. It was mutual recognition. Two people who hadn't been spared much, but were still standing anyway. Later that afternoon, they sat beneath the cottonwood near the south fence line, a pot of coffee between them. The sun was lowering, golden and harsh against the dirt. Calla leaned back against the trunk and finally allowed herself to relax. Her eyes followed a hawk circling far overhead. "If you ever decide to send me away," she said suddenly, "just tell me straight." Silas didn't look at her. "If I wanted you gone, you'd be gone already." "Maybe, but I've learned not to count on what people don't say." He finally met her gaze. "Then hear it now. I don't want you gone." She nodded, then looked down at her hands. He added, "I don't know what this is between us yet, but it ain't charity." Calla let that sit for a moment. "I know." The wind picked up slightly, stirring the grass around them. Distant thunder rumbled over the hills. Spring storms still passed through this time of year, but the scent of the air had changed. No longer dry, but full, like the land was coming back to life after a long sleep. That night, she cooked again. Biscuits, beans, a bit of salt pork Silas had smoked himself months back. They ate without speaking, but the silence was easier now, less heavy. Before turning in, Silas walked to the porch. Calla followed, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild air. He scanned the ridgeline. "Think they'll come?" she asked. He nodded once. "Eventually." She swallowed. "You'll be ready?" "I've been ready for worse." She stepped beside him. "So have I." And for the first time since she'd arrived, she rested her hand on his arm. Just for a second. Then she went inside. He didn't move. Just stood there, watching the dark. The wind changed on the fifth morning. Silas noticed it before the sun was fully up. The air had a bite again. Not cold, but sharp, carrying the kind of stillness that didn't belong. The birds were quiet. Even the dog, who usually roamed the fence line before breakfast, stayed curled under the porch. Calla felt it too. She came in from the coop slower than usual, her shoulders tight. Ridge was quiet, she said, but the crows are circling again. Silas didn't reply right away. He poured the coffee, sat down, and didn't touch the mug. Calla leaned against the doorway, waiting. Finally, he said, "There's eyes on us. Somewhere." She didn't flinch. "We leave." He shook his head. "No, this is my land. If they want something, they can come ask for it. And if they don't ask, then they find out what happens when they don't." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a threat. It was a man stating what he was willing to do and what he was no longer willing to lose. They spent the day preparing, neither of them saying much. Silas cleaned the rifles and stacked extra wood inside. Calla filled the water buckets and moved the feed sacks closer to the house. She checked the cellar for anything useful: lanterns, a spool of rope, spare bullets. Every task was deliberate, quiet. No panic, just purpose. At dusk, Silas showed her where the cellar trapdoor was under the rug in the back room. "If I tell you to go," he said, "you go." Calla met his eyes. "Only if you're behind me." He didn't argue, just nodded once and moved on. When the sun finally dropped, they sat near the hearth again. No food tonight. Neither of them had the stomach for it. Just coffee and silence. Calla rested the rifle across her lap. Her boots were tied, hair pulled back. Her eyes stayed on the window. "You think it's him?" she asked softly. Silas didn't answer at first. He looked toward the darkened yard. "It's been long enough for word to spread. Someone will come sniffing, if they haven't already." She leaned back slightly, jaw tight. "He doesn't leave things unfinished. If he's not already here, he's close." "You sure it's worth staying?" he asked. "You still got time to run." She looked at him, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Not running anymore, remember?" A long silence passed. Then, in the same even tone, "You scared?" she asked. Silas took a breath. "Yeah." She didn't react with surprise. She just nodded. "Me too." They didn't sleep that night. They sat by the fire, both watching the door, the windows, the shadows that didn't belong. They took turns stepping onto the porch to listen. The moon rose and fell. Nothing came. But just before dawn, Silas heard the faintest crunch in the distance. Boots on gravel. Slow. Careful. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, and scanned the horizon. Nothing. Then, a low whistle. Not close, but not far either. He went back inside. Calla was already standing, rifle raised, jaw clenched. "They're here," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't have to. He blew out the lamp. The ranch fell into stillness. The only light came from the dull glow of coals in the hearth. Everything else, the rooms, the corners, the porch, went black. They waited. 20 minutes passed. Maybe more. The kind of waiting that stretches time too thin. Then, footsteps on the porch. Deliberate. Slow. Calla tightened her grip on the rifle. A voice came through the door. Low. Confident. "Girl, I know you're in there." Silas moved to the door, back against the wall. His rifle was up. "Safety off." The voice continued. "You made it farther than most, but you should have kept running. Thought you'd be smart, hiding out with a lonely old man." Calla took a deep breath. Her hands were steady now. The voice got closer. "You know how this ends, Calla. You open that door, I'll make it quick. You don't, and I'll come in slow." She looked at Silas. He nodded once, gave her the signal. She moved quickly behind the table, crouched low. Silas took one step toward the door and cocked the rifle loud enough for the man outside to hear. Silence. Then the voice shifted. Harder, colder. "Braddock, you open this door and hand her over, and we ain't got to do this the ugly way." Silas spoke for the first time. "She's not going anywhere." A long pause. Then laughter. Dark, crooked. "Suit yourself, old man." A second later, glass shattered, a window by the far side. Silas swung toward it instantly, eyes sharp. Then, wood splintered on the back door. They were coming from both sides. Calla didn't hesitate. She moved toward the cellar trapdoor, opened it, but didn't go down. Silas, stay with me, he said. She nodded. The next moments would decide everything. The back door cracked first. Just a single blow, sharp, fast testing. Then came another, heavier, intentional. Hinges groaned. Silas moved fast. Stay low, he told Calla, stepping toward the hallway where the second entrance sat half-hidden behind the stove. He positioned himself against the wall, rifle raised. Breath even, shoulders squared. Calla, crouched behind the table, gripped her own weapon with white knuckles. She didn't shake this time. The door gave way on the third hit. A booted man forcing it open, his silhouette wide in the flickering firelight. He stepped in quick, gun drawn. Silas fired once. The shot dropped the man instantly. No warning. No hesitation. Just years of muscle memory and a clear decision made hours ago. Another voice shouted from outside. Damn fool. Then a second figure moved into view through the shattered window. He aimed toward the table, toward Calla. But she was faster. Her shot cracked through the stillness, and the second man dropped with a grunt, slamming into the porch post and dragging half the doorframe down with him. Then nothing. No more footsteps. No more voices. Just silence. Silas moved slowly to the front door, rifle still up. He scanned the yard. No more shadows. No more movement. Calla stood now, breath sharp but steady. She looked out past him into the dark, trying to see what came next. Clear, he said quietly. She didn't speak, just nodded once and lowered her rifle. It was over. They dragged the bodies to the edge of the property before sunup. Said nothing while they worked. There was no ceremony, no final words. Just the sound of boots in dirt and the weight of dead choices being hauled away from the living. By the time the sun was up, the porch was swept clean. The doors rehinged. The window boarded. Smoke rose from the chimney again. Calla sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee. She looked tired, but not afraid. Silas joined her, rubbing his palms together as he sat beside her. You all right? He asked. She gave a slow nod. I didn't freeze. No, you didn't. Always thought I would. When it counted. You didn't. They sat in silence for a long time. The land was still. Birds had returned to the fence line. The mare walked easy in the paddock again. Finally, Calla said, he won't come. That was his last move. He never shows up when the men he sends don't return. Cuts his losses. Silas looked over at her. Good. He can keep losing. She smiled, small, quiet. The first real smile since she'd arrived. I think I'd like to stay, she said. You already are. She turned her head slowly toward him. You don't mind? I fixed that porch twice. Boarded the window 3 times. You're more trouble than you're worth. Her smile widened, just a little. He added, more seriously this time. This house needed a reason to stay standing. You gave it one. That night, they didn't sit across the room from each other. They sat side by side.